The morning began in the hum of engines. Dawn came slow over the coral runway of Iwo Jima, painting the world in muted orange and ash grey. The sea glimmered beyond the airfield, restless and cold, and the smell of aviation fuel clung to everything, to the steel barrels, to the mechanics, to the very wind. Lieutenant William Bill Harlow, 27 years old, stood beside his P-38 Lightning, tightening the strap of his flight helmet. The twin-boomed fighter shimmered under the weak sunlight, its polished metal skin already warm to the touch. The ground crew moved around it like shadows, checking propellers, securing ammo belts, refueling the tanks with quick, efficient motions. Bill ran his hand along the wing's leading edge. The plane felt alive, almost breathing, the hum of potential energy trapped beneath its silver skin. He loved the Lightning more than any woman he'd ever known. It wasn't just a machine. It was a partner. 2 engines, 2 hearts, working in perfect balance. Lose one and she'd limp home on the other. Lose both, and you'd fall fast and hard. "Fuel topped off," one of the crew shouted over the wind. "She's ready, Lieutenant." Bill nodded. "Thanks, Charlie." He checked the sky. Thin clouds drifted east, faint against the deepening blue. The air was still, ideal flying weather, at least for now. His mission was simple: reconnaissance over Honshu, photograph coastal defences, shipping lanes and industrial yards near Tokyo Bay. A long flight, but not unusual. They were pushing deeper into enemy airspace now, and the P-38's range made it the only plane fit for the job. As he climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of oil and leather filled his lungs. He strapped in, adjusted the oxygen mask and flicked the switches. The Allison engines coughed once, twice, then came alive with a rising snarl that vibrated through his bones. The propellers blurred into silver discs. Control tower crackled in his headset. "Lightning 271 cleared for takeoff. Good hunting, Harlow." "Copy that. See you boys for dinner," he replied, voice steady but heart-hammering. The P-38 rolled forward, gathering speed. The runway blurred beneath him, the tail lifted, and with a sudden lightness the ground fell away. The twin engines purred as the island shrank behind him into a patch of coral and smoke. Ahead lay the endless blue, and beyond it, the enemy's homeland. Hours passed. The sea below looked like glass, unbroken and endless. The rhythmic drone of the engines became a kind of hypnosis. Bill adjusted the trim, checked the gauges. Fuel pressure good, oil temperature steady. He took a sip from his canteen and exhaled slowly. It was beautiful, in a strange way. War at its quietest. No flak, no radio chatter, no horizon cluttered with black smoke. Just the hum of the Lightning and the wide Pacific breathing beneath. But beauty, he knew, was fragile here. It never lasted. At 10:47 a.m., the first sign of trouble came. A sudden hiccup from the right engine. The smooth rhythm faltered. Bill's head snapped around. The manifold pressure gauge flickered. He adjusted the throttle, feathered the prop slightly. The sound evened out, but unease coiled in his gut. A few minutes later, the left engine coughed too. He checked the fuel selector. Both tanks read normal. Pressure holding, electrical steady, nothing obvious. Still, the engines were restless, as if something invisible tugged at them. "Not now," he muttered under his breath. "Not here." He tapped the compass. North-northwest, on course. The sky was beginning to haze over with thin cloud. Visibility dropped. The coastline of Honshu should have appeared soon, but the horizon had vanished in white. He tried the radio. Static. "Base, this is Lightning 271, reading you?" Only the hiss of dead air. He switched frequencies. "Control, this is Harlow, do you copy?" Nothing. A fine sweat broke on his neck. He switched back, checked his map, folded, creased, damp from his gloves. Windrift had probably pushed him off course, maybe 100 miles or more. Without landmarks or radio navigation, he was flying blind. The clouds thickened. The world turned grey. Lightning flashed somewhere ahead, distant and pale. Ironic, he thought, that the lightning should fly into lightning. He descended slightly, trying to stay beneath the storm layer, but the sea disappeared into fog. Altimeter steady at 2,000 feet. He strained his eyes for a glimpse of land, of anything, a ship, a ridge, a shadow on the water. Then, through the haze, something appeared. A coastline, dark, jagged, unmistakable. But it was not the coastline he'd hoped for. He recognized the shape from reconnaissance photos, Tokyo Bay. His breath caught. He was deep inside enemy airspace. Bill's hands moved without thought, throttling down, scanning the sky. He expected flak at any second, searchlights, fighters, but the air remained eerily calm. Below, the bay glittered like polished steel dotted with ships. He had no choice. Fuel was low, radio dead, and the nearest friendly base was hundreds of miles away. He checked his pistol, one magazine. Not much, but better than nothing. The right engine sputtered again, coughing out a stream of black smoke. Oil pressure dropped to 0. The propeller slowed. He feathered it instantly, isolating the failed side. The plane shuddered but held altitude. "Come on, girl, don't quit on me now," he said through gritted teeth. The left engine strained, fighting alone against gravity and drag. The gauges dipped lower, inch by inch. He could feel it, the pull downward, the weight of inevitability. There was no time left. He turned toward the open water, away from the city, away from the gun batteries that lined the coast. If he was going down, he'd rather drown than give them a perfect landing prize. The lightning skimmed the waves now, barely a few hundred feet up. He unlatched the canopy, ready to bail if needed. The spray from the sea stung his face. The engine roared one last time, then died completely. Silence filled the cockpit, a heavy, absolute silence broken only by the wind. Bill levelled the wings. The sea rushed up to meet him. Impact. The plane hit the water hard, bounced once, then slid across the surface in a plume of white foam. The nose dipped, the tail rose, and for a moment it seemed the lightning would sink nose first into the bay. But somehow it settled, floating just long enough for him to unbuckle and climb out. The water was freezing. He gasped as it hit his body, kicking away from the sinking wreck. The P-38 tilted, one wing rising like a salute, then vanished beneath the grey waves. Bill floated on his back, chest heaving, staring up at the sky. The clouds above Tokyo drifted silently, indifferent. In the distance he heard shouts, small boats, engines. He turned his head and saw them, wooden patrol vessels, flags painted with red suns, heading straight toward him. He closed his eyes. The war for him was over, and somewhere beneath him, in the quiet dark of the bay, the lightning rested, silver, broken, and strangely peaceful. The sea was grey and endless, stretching beyond the horizon like an iron plate. Bill Harlow floated among the waves, his flight suit heavy with water, his body numbed by the cold. The life vest kept him barely above the surface. Each breath came shallow and ragged. He could taste the salt, the oil, and something metallic. Blood. In the distance the small wooden boats grew larger. Their engines rattled unevenly, coughing against the chop of the waves. Japanese voices carried over the wind, sharp, clipped, urgent. Bill felt his pulse hammer against his throat. He had no weapon now. His sidearm was lost when he hit the water. He turned slowly, trying not to move too much, as if stillness could make him invisible. But they had seen him. The first boat came close enough for him to make out the figures on board. Fishermen or soldiers, he couldn't tell. Rough uniforms, canvas caps, rifles slung across their backs. One of them shouted and pointed, another raised a pistol. Bill lifted his hands from the water. "Don't shoot," he called, his voice hoarse, cracking with exhaustion. They circled him like cautious predators. The nearest man leaned over the side, shouting in Japanese. Bill caught a few words. Hikoki, airplane, America Jin, American. He nodded weakly. Yes, American, US Air Force. A rope was thrown at him. He grasped it, fingers numb, and was hauled toward the boat. Two men leaned down and grabbed his arms, dragging him aboard. The deck was slick with seawater. Someone kicked his legs out from under him, forcing him to his knees. He looked up. Their faces were young, teenagers maybe, terrified, angry, exhausted. He saw his own reflection in their eyes, a ghost, soaked, shivering, defeated. They tied his wrists and pushed him to the bow. The engine sputtered to life again, and the boat turned toward the coast. Behind them, black smoke still marked where his P-38 had gone under. For a moment he thought of diving back into the sea, but his body refused. The shoreline grew sharper. Wooden docks, fishing nets, and a few wooden houses appeared through the mist. Beyond them, smoke rose in the distance, perhaps from factories, perhaps from fires. When they reached the pier, a small crowd had already gathered. Fishermen, children, old men. They murmured as he was led off the boat, their eyes wide with something between awe and hatred. Bill tried not to meet their gaze. A military truck waited nearby. The soldiers shoved him into the back beside two armed guards. The door slammed shut and the truck jolted forward. The road was rough and narrow. Through a crack in the wooden slats, Bill caught glimpses of the countryside. Rice fields drowned in mud, half-destroyed houses, stretches of grey sea. The war had reached even here, it seemed. After an hour, the truck stopped at a walled compound. He was pulled out, pushed through a gate, and brought into a low building that smelled of damp tatami and kerosene. Inside, a Japanese officer in a neat khaki uniform sat behind a desk. His cap was placed carefully beside a stack of papers. He didn't look up right away, letting the silence stretch thin and sharp. When he finally did, his expression was unreadable. "Name," he said in accented English. "Lieutenant William Harlow, U.S. Army Air Forces." "Unit?" 49th Fighter Group. The officer wrote something down. "Mission?" Bill hesitated. His training echoed in his head. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing more. "Reconnaissance," he said finally. "Routine flight." The officer's pen paused. He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Routine? Over Tokyo Bay?" Bill said nothing. The officer's mouth twitched, just enough to suggest a smile. He nodded to one of the guards. A sharp blow landed across the back of Bill's head, sending a flash of white pain through his vision. When he looked up again, the officer was already writing again. "You will tell us what you photographed," he said calmly, "and what you were ordered to find." Bill wiped the blood from his lip with his sleeve. "I told you. Routine." The officer sighed softly as if disappointed in a stubborn child. "You Americans," he said, "always believing that courage is louder than reason." He stood, motioning for the guards to take him away. Put him with the others. The others, as it turned out, were two half-starved men in another room, one British, one Australian, both in tattered uniforms. They looked up as Bill was shoved inside. "New arrival?" the Brit muttered, his voice rasping. "Yeah," Bill said, sitting against the wall. "Lightning pilot." The Australian gave a low whistle. "Bloody hell, you flew that twin-tail thing, didn't you? We saw one go down weeks ago." "That was me," Bill said quietly. They fell silent. The air smelled of mould and sweat. Outside, the wind moaned against the wooden shutters. After a long moment, the Brit spoke again. "You're lucky, mate. They usually don't bother pulling pilots out of the sea anymore. Must be your plane they're after." Bill looked at him sharply. "My plane?" "Yeah. Word is they've got divers out there in the bay already, trying to haul it up." Bill's stomach turned cold. The P-38, his Lightning, was more than just wreckage. It was full of secrets. Camera film, radio codes, advanced engine components the Japanese had never seen. If they got to it first. He pressed his hands to his face, trying to think, trying not to imagine their engineers pulling apart her twin Allisons, her turbochargers, her guns. The Brit saw his expression. "Don't beat yourself up, Yank. They'll never get her to fly, not in one piece anyway." Bill didn't answer. He closed his eyes and listened to the rain starting outside, each drop striking the roof like the ticking of a clock. Days passed, maybe 3, maybe 4. The light never changed much in the cell. They were fed twice a day. Thin soup, a handful of rice, sometimes a sliver of fish. Once, through the barred window, Bill saw his captors on the beach below. The tide was low. In the distance, cranes and barges clustered around a spot in the bay. He didn't need binoculars to know what they were doing. They were raising his Lightning. He watched until night fell, until the silhouettes disappeared into the fog. Somewhere beneath those waves, the wreck of his plane had slept, and now the enemy was waking it. That night he dreamed of flying again. The sound of engines in perfect sync, the horizon endless, the world clean and blue. But when he looked down, the land below wasn't Japan or the Pacific. It was nothing but water, black and silent. He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the memory of that smooth hum still in his ears. For a moment he couldn't tell if he'd ever really left the sky. He sat up slowly, the floor cold beneath him. The British pilot was still asleep. The Australian snored softly. Outside a bell rang, distant, metallic. The sound echoed over the compound, Boots approached the door. It opened with a creak, flooding the dim cell with light. A soldier stepped in, gesturing sharply. "America Gin," he said. "Come." Bill stood, his legs stiff, his throat dry. "Where?" he asked. The soldier didn't answer. He just pointed toward the gate, where the dawn was breaking pale and colourless over the water. Bill knew before he saw it. They had brought something back from the bay, and now they wanted him to see it too. Bill's boots thudded against the wooden planks of the pier as he followed the soldier down a narrow path. The air was thick with the scent of salt smoke and something acrid he couldn't name. In the early morning light, the bay spread before him like a sheet of silver glass, interrupted only by small fishing boats and clusters of barges. At the centre, surrounded by cranes and a bustle of uniformed men, was his P-38 Lightning. It was a strange sight, surreal, almost dreamlike. The water had been shallow enough to lift her partially, so she sat tilted on supports, her twin booms gleaming wetly in the grey light. The propellers were still, but the aircraft itself seemed to hum with life, as if aware that it had been wrenched from the sea and brought here against its will. Bill froze. His mind refused to process it fully. There it was, his plane, damaged but intact. The nose was scraped, the canopy cracked, the paint flaked from salt water and impact, but the twin engines gleamed darkly in the cold dawn. A Japanese officer approached, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and calculating. His uniform was neat, every crease precise. He didn't smile. Instead, he gestured sharply to the wreck. "America Gin," he said, his accent clipped. "You will explain." Bill's stomach tightened. He wanted to answer, to say nothing to see here, but the truth was clear. The aircraft spoke for itself. Every twisted panel, every rivet torn by the sea, every scar along the fuselage told the story of the flight. Soldiers moved around the P-38 with the careful, clinical precision of engineers dissecting something alive. They prodded the wings with wooden poles, checked the landing gear supports, and measured the propeller pitch with calipers. One officer leaned close, inspecting the machine guns in the nose, muttering to himself in rapid Japanese. Bill followed, forced to crouch to avoid the throng of soldiers. He had never seen anyone approach an aircraft like this, as though it were more than a plane, a puzzle, a prize, a weapon of secrets. A crane lowered a large crate beside the Lightning. Men opened it to reveal tools, spare parts, and curious devices he didn't recognize. Cameras were set up on tripods, taking photographs from every angle. The officer motioned to Bill. "Explain engine operation," he said. "Fuel, turbocharger, cooling, maintenance schedule, everything." Bill swallowed. I cannot. I do not speak Japanese, and even if I did, I am not authorized." His words trailed off under the weight of their staring eyes. The officer's mouth twitched slightly, the hint of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He snapped his fingers. A younger officer approached, holding a small notebook and pencil. He scribbled furiously, glancing at Bill, then back at the older officer. Bill realized, with a chill, that even without understanding everything they were writing, the Japanese had already started documenting every detail. Every panel removed, every control checked, every engine mount photographed. He moved closer to the nose, touching the canopy with gloved hands. The glass was still cold, streaked with salt and impact marks. Through it, he saw the cockpit intact, dials, levers, and the sighting equipment he had trusted with his life. The thought struck him like a blow. They were going to know it all. Every strength, every weakness, every trick he had used to push her to the limit. A young soldier climbed onto the wing, peering into the starboard engine cowling. He fumbled with a wrench, forcing open panels. Bill's heart skipped. "Careful!" he shouted in English, hoping they might understand tone if not words. The soldier froze, looking at him as if seeing a ghost, then shrugged and continued. Around them, the bay itself seemed to mirror the tension. The water lapped gently against the supports holding the P-38, a stark contrast to the violence of the war that had brought it here. The sun broke through the clouds, glittering off the wet aluminum like a promise that the Lightning still lived. Bill was led to the rear, near the tail booms. He knelt beside the vertical stabilizer, tracing a line with a finger where the water had torn at the skin. His mind drifted, thinking of the flight over the Pacific, the low sun, the endless waves, the moment when he had realized he would have to land on water. The memory hit again, visceral. The bounce on the waves, the shock of cold, the instant of total stillness as the P-38 came to rest. He remembered checking each gauge in the cockpit one last time before unbuckling. How strangely alive she had seemed, even then. He looked up to see a diver emerging from the water, carrying a corroded panel from the lower fuselage. The officer motioned to him. "This," he said, tapping the panel. "Explain. Why? How?" Bill's hands shook. He could only gesture vaguely, helpless. Words were useless here. They had already seen everything. The film cameras, the meticulous sketches, the measurements. From the pier, he saw another P-38 in the distance, silhouetted against the rising sun. Allied aircraft patrolling, unaware of his plight, unaware of what lay beneath these waters. He felt the ache of isolation, not just from his own forces but from the sky itself. The P-38 had been a bridge between him and freedom. Now it was a bridge to the enemy, dissected for knowledge he could not control. Time passed. Soldiers continued their work, oblivious to him. He was left near the water, watching the slow, methodical removal of panels, the careful lifting of engines, every component catalogued, every rivet numbered, and then came the silence. For a moment, the bay seemed to hold its breath. Even the gulls above did not move. Bill realized that, in their effort to control the machine, the Japanese were unaware that the P-38 was more than metal and fuel. It was history, memory, and human will carried in steel and circuitry. It remembered the sky it had been born to dominate. He shivered, not from cold, but from understanding. This aircraft, his aircraft, would never belong to them. They could study her, strip her, replicate her design, even fly her if they were bold enough. But they would never capture what made her alive. The moment she had broken through clouds, fought against gravity, and carried a human heart with her. The officer motioned again, and two soldiers approached Bill. "Rest," they said in broken English. "Wait, tomorrow we move the Lightning to hangar." Bill nodded silently, stepping back. He looked once more at the sun reflecting off the silver wings, remembering the roar of engines, the pull of the stick, the endless Pacific below. He wondered if he would ever see that sky again, or if the P-38, the Lightning, would ever rise in freedom, carrying the ghosts of both pilot and war across the clouds. As night fell over Tokyo Bay, the floating aircraft lay surrounded by lanterns and soldiers, a surreal monument to war and survival. Above, stars began to pierce the dark, faintly mirrored in the water below. The P-38 gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a lone lightning bolt stranded in enemy hands, yet alive in memory, waiting for the day it might fly again. And in that quiet, Bill Harlow realized that survival was only the beginning. The true test was watching the world take apart what he had built, piece by piece, and staying alive, body, mind, and spirit, to witness it all. The lanterns flickered against the walls of the hangar, casting long shadows across the wet deck where the P-38 rested. Bill Harlow was led along the plank floor, wrists bound with coarse rope, through the maze of cranes and curious soldiers who had already begun stripping the aircraft of anything they deemed useful. The smell of salt, oil, and heated metal mingled with the faint stench of dried fish from the docks outside, a reminder that he was no longer in the world he knew. Inside, the hangar was a cathedral of metal and discipline. Wooden beams groaned under the weight of the roof, and every step echoed like a drumbeat. Japanese engineers and mechanics in pressed khaki uniforms moved with silent precision, carrying instruments, measuring tools and notebooks. The air was thick with the hum of electricity and the quiet murmur of men observing, calculating, recording. He was pushed to a small room adjacent to the hangar, bare except for a wooden table, a low stool, and a single lamp. The walls were adorned with charts and diagrams in neat black ink. The precise Japanese characters mapping territories, aircraft silhouettes, and technical schematics. The officer from the pier entered, clipboard in hand, followed by two junior engineers. "Sit," the officer commanded. His tone was sharp, not unkind, but absolute. Bill sank onto the stool, limbs aching from hours of standing and exposure. His head still throbbed from the rough handling, his clothes damp and clinging. He could hear the distant clatter of tools, the soft scraping of metal, the occasional clang of a dropped wrench from the hangar floor. Explain the aircraft, the officer said. Engines, flight systems, armament, cameras, radio, everything. Bill shook his head. Words failed him. Nothing I say can stop them from seeing it anyway. I cannot. I am not authorized. I am a pilot, not a mechanic. The officer tilted his head. He scribbled in a notebook, then gestured for the engineers to approach. 2 men stepped forward, instruments in hand, and began pointing at diagrams of the P-38 that the Japanese had prepared from the initial observations at the bay. They want to know every function, Bill murmured. Every detail. One engineer leaned in, pointing at the starboard engine diagram. He spoke rapidly, the words clipped and precise. Bill only understood the tone, interrogative, demanding. The man circled a diagram of the turbocharger. Bill shook his head. Allison V-17 Dustier, 2-stage supercharger, compresses air for high-altitude performance. Controls, automatic boost, manually adjustable if needed. The engineer paused, scribbling furiously. The officer looked up, eyebrow raised, then motioned to another diagram, the nose of the aircraft. Guns, camera mounts, sight equipment. Bill explained what he could. How the guns synchronized, how the camera triggered, how the sight assisted bombing and strafing accuracy. Hours passed in this fashion. Bill's voice grew hoarse. Sweat dripped down his back, though the hangar was cold. He traced the shapes of the wings in the air with his fingers, as if by outlining them he could communicate without speaking. The engineers leaned closer, eyes bright with curiosity and calculation. They would see every detail. He knew that. He could not stop them. At one point, a junior officer brought a small box. Inside, what appeared to be film canisters and a few stripped components from the cockpit. They set them on the table with meticulous care. The officer motioned for Bill to identify them. He traced each one, the aerial reconnaissance film, the camera mechanism, the small radio transceiver. Each explanation was catalogued, sketched, noted, cross-referenced. Outside, the bay shimmered with the early afternoon sun. The tide had shifted, leaving the supports beneath the P-38 exposed. Divers were already at work, extracting panels, lifting engines, noting every rivet. Bill could hear the soft groan of wood and steel as the crane adjusted the plane's position. Every creak echoed in his chest. He thought of the flight over the Pacific, the endless horizon, the roar of engines, the tension as he skimmed the waves to land. That memory was sharp, almost tangible, cutting through the fog of his current captivity. He had brought the lightning to life. Now, the Japanese were dissecting that life, piece by piece. A Japanese officer entered with a hand-drawn map of Tokyo Bay. He gestured toward the P-38's resting place, then at Bill. He spoke quickly, fingers stabbing at the paper. Bill understood only the intent. How did you manage to land it here? He hesitated. Truth or survival? He spoke slowly. Water landing, engine failure, had no choice, could not reach friendly territory, had to preserve aircraft. The officer nodded sharply, apparently satisfied with the mechanics, though not with the pilot. Bill felt the weight of eyes on him. Curiosity, suspicion, respect. It was an uncomfortable recognition. They knew he had flown her to the limit, and perhaps survived only by skill and luck. Time blurred. The engineers moved from diagrams to the physical aircraft, measuring, prodding, photographing. Bill was dragged back into the hangar, forced to watch as they worked around the floating hull. One by one, panels were removed, engines inspected, the cockpit carefully scrutinized. Every lever, every gauge, every broken rivet catalogued. At dusk, Bill was left alone near the tail boom. The hangar lights cast long shadows, giving the P-38 an almost spectral appearance. She gleamed faintly, wet and cold, but alive in a way only a pilot could recognize. The bay reflected her silver wings like liquid mirrors. Somewhere far off, a distant B-29 droned, a reminder of the war pressing in from above. He sat on the wet deck, knees drawn to his chest, and tried to shut out the sound of clanging metal and scribbling pens. He imagined the sky again, the twin engines roaring, the horizon endless. The engineers could take the plane apart, record every detail, but they could never understand what it felt like to fly her, to feel the lightning respond to your touch, to trust her with your life. Night fell over Tokyo Bay. Lanterns flickered across the water, casting moving shadows. Bill closed his eyes and let the sounds of the hangar and the bay wash over him. He realized that the P-38 was no longer just an aircraft. She was a symbol now of survival, of ingenuity, and of the fragile line between life and death over an enemy's territory. And in the shadows, Bill swore he could feel her, the machine he had trusted with his life, waiting for the day she might rise again, above the clouds, above the war, and beyond the hands that sought to control her. The hangar was silent except for the faint scratch of pencils on paper and the occasional clang of metal against metal. Bill Harlow sat on a low crate, wrists still bound, watching the engineers move around his P-38 with the precision of surgeons. Every panel they removed, every engine component they lifted, every lever they documented. It was as though they were attempting to take the Lightning's soul apart piece by piece. The Japanese engineers worked methodically, systematically cataloguing every detail. The twin Allison engines were their first focus. They pried open the cowling, inspecting pistons, turbochargers, fuel injectors. Every measurement was recorded in neat Japanese characters. Bill watched, helpless, as they photographed the engines from multiple angles, creating diagrams he knew would never fully capture the essence of the machine, yet would allow them to attempt replication. They moved next to the cockpit. The instrument panel, the gun sight, the camera mounts. Every piece was studied with meticulous care. One young engineer carefully lifted the Norden-style bomb sight, turning it over in his hands. Bill knew instantly that they would never understand how to use it in real combat, but the desire to replicate it was evident in the intensity of their focus. He realized then that the Japanese weren't trying to just fix the plane. They were trying to decode it, to reverse engineer every innovation that had allowed the Allies to dominate the skies over the Pacific. The officer who had interrogated him earlier walked past, clipboard in hand, observing. He gestured for Bill to approach. Reluctantly, Bill stood, trying to appear composed, though a knot of frustration and fear coiled in his stomach. "Explain the engine again," the officer commanded. Bill obeyed, speaking slowly and clearly, hoping the words would at least convey the general function. The Allison V-1710 is a liquid-cooled V-12. Twin superchargers provide high-altitude power. Fuel is metered through carburetors. Ignition timing is automatic but adjustable. The officer scribbled furiously, then nodded. Bill could tell that while the technical explanation satisfied them, it did nothing to stop the engineers from opening every panel and measuring every part. Hours bled into days. The engineers rotated shifts, sometimes working silently through the night, lit only by lanterns that cast long, trembling shadows over the P-38's gleaming fuselage. They measured, they photographed, they drew diagrams, they recorded serial numbers. Each note, each sketch, each measurement was a step toward understanding the machine, or at least what they believed they could understand. Bill's frustration grew. He knew they would never be able to replicate the aircraft fully. The nuances of flying the Lightning, the way the twin engines responded to subtle adjustments, the delicate balance of fuel and air, the feel of the controls under stress, that could not be drawn on paper. It could only be felt in the sky, by a pilot who had trusted the machine with his life. He caught one young engineer adjusting the throttle quadrant, turning the levers back and forth. Bill stepped forward sharply. "Careful," he warned in English, but the engineer only looked at him, puzzled. He repeated the motion mechanically, as though testing a theory, and Bill realized they would never understand what he meant. The officer motioned for another engineer to join him, and together they began disassembling the gun system. Bill explained the mechanics, how the triggers were synchronized, how the ammunition fed, how the firing mechanism worked in tandem with the propeller. Again, the engineers recorded everything, their eyes alight with a mixture of wonder and determination. Outside, the bay stretched calm and grey. Occasionally a patrol plane droned overhead, unaware of the P-38 sitting in the enemy hangar, dissected like a bird whose wings had been clipped. Bill imagined himself back in the cockpit, feeling the stick vibrate in his hands, the engines thrumming in perfect harmony. The thought brought a pang of both longing and despair. The officer returned later that day with a new order. The P-38 would be moved to a larger facility, a more secure hangar where they could continue their work without interference. Bill was forced to watch as cranes lifted the aircraft from its supports, the hull groaning under the stress. Engineers noted every angle, every rivet, ensuring that nothing was lost. As the plane was lowered onto the transport platform, Bill's mind raced. Every component, every detail, every nuance of the lightning was being catalogued, recorded, and stored. And yet, he knew, no blueprint, no diagram, no amount of measurement could replicate the essence of flight, the instinctive trust between pilot and machine. By the evening, Bill was exhausted. He sat on the cold floor of the cell listening to the distant hum of activity in the hangar. Outside, the tide rose and fell in the bay, washing against the supports and reflecting the lantern light. Somewhere beneath the water, the remnants of his plane's landing gear glinted, a reminder of the moment she had first touched the sea. He thought of the flight across the Pacific, of the endless horizon, the roar of the engines and the pull of the stick. That memory was alive, sharper than any diagram, stronger than any calculation. The engineers could replicate the parts. They could never replicate the courage, the timing, the human touch that had brought the P-38 safely to Tokyo Bay. Night fell. Lanterns flickered, casting eerie shadows over the hangar. Bill closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him, the scratch of pencils, the clatter of metal, the soft lapping of water against the pilings. In the quiet, he felt the presence of the lightning waiting, as if understanding that she was trapped, yet still alive. Somewhere in the distance, the faint roar of engines echoed over the water. Allied bombers on a mission, oblivious to the small hangar below, where a single P-38 lay dissected, studied, and captured. Bill listened, letting the sound fill him with both sorrow and resolve. He knew survival was no longer simply about keeping his body alive. It was about watching, enduring, and hoping. Hoping that one day the P-38 would rise again, not as a collection of parts, not as a study, but as the aircraft it had always been, a machine of speed, precision, and life. And somewhere, in the metallic heart of the lightning, Bill Harlow felt a spark, a memory of flight, a whisper of freedom, and the unshakable certainty that even in captivity, even under enemy hands, some things could not be stolen. The P-38 sat under lantern light, gleaming faintly, surrounded by men who sought to understand her, who could measure her, who could even copy her. But they could not capture her spirit. And Bill, prisoner of circumstance, bore witness, the only one left to remember what it meant to fly her. The war was ending, though the air still trembled with distant explosions. Over Tokyo Bay the horizon glimmered in a cold grey light. Smoke rose in soft pillars from the city, remnants of firebombing, reminders of a nation brought to its knees. Bill Harlow, thin, sunburned and weathered, was still under guard, still bound by circumstance, yet no longer by hope. The P-38 Lightning had been moved again. The Japanese engineers, forced to abandon many projects as the Empire crumbled, left it in a flooded section of the hangar near the edge of the bay. Cranes had rusted in place, parts were scattered, some salvaged for other aircraft, some left as trophies of a war too far gone to continue. The plane, once gleaming and powerful, now sat like a wounded beast, half submerged in water, wings crooked, panels missing. Bill approached the edge of the pier, careful not to slip on the wet boards. The tide lapped at the supports, carrying the scent of salt and decay. He paused, watching the silhouette of his aircraft. She was still recognizable, still the same Lightning he had flown across the Pacific, but she had been changed, marked by human hands and by circumstance. He knelt, running his fingers along a wing strut still above water. The aluminum was cold, rough, etched with rust and scars from both the landing and months of inspection. He remembered the day he had first seen her in flight, the roar of the twin engines, the effortless lift over the horizon, the way the controls had responded to his touch as though she were alive. That memory seemed impossibly distant, yet sharper than the reality before him. A low hum reached him from the water. Not an engine, not any more. Just the gentle pulse of the bay, the rhythm of tides and waves. He imagined her rising again, slicing through clouds, sun, engines roaring in unison. But reality was cruel. The war had ended, the Empire had collapsed, and the P-38 lay broken in a bay that would soon be occupied by forces who would never understand her, or him. Soldiers moved quietly in the background, collecting what they could, preparing to surrender or abandon their posts. They no longer needed the plane. The war had shifted, and in the chaos Bill realized something profound. The P-38 was not theirs anymore, nor entirely his. She belonged to memory now, a fragment of the sky, a story of survival, a reminder of what had been risked and endured. He sat back on the pier, letting the chill seep into his bones. Around him, the bay reflected the first light of dawn, clouds tinted pink and gold, streaked with grey. The city beyond was silent, exhausted, waiting for a future it could not yet imagine. And in the water below, the lightning rested, caught between two worlds, alive in his memory, inert in reality. Bill closed his eyes. He could hear the roar of engines again, the feel of the controls, the hum of life beneath his hands. He could smell the oil and gasoline, feel the vibration through the seat, taste the salt of ocean spray. Everything else, the ropes, the guards, the crumbling empire, faded. All that remained was the essence of flight, the bond between man and machine. Hours passed. The tide rose, lapping higher against the supports. Bill's guards dozed nearby, trusting him to stay put, as if sensing he had become part of the scene, as if even they recognized the reverence owed to the aircraft. A single crane groaned in the distance, swaying with the wind. Bill imagined it lifting the lightning back into the sky. He smiled faintly, a private, impossible joke. In his mind she rose again, twin engines roaring, cutting through clouds, carrying him away from the bay, away from captivity, back into the endless Pacific. By evening the city lay in quiet surrender. Fires had died down. The bay reflected a silver moon, and the P-38 rested motionless beneath its light. Bill, standing on the pier, watched the faint ripples around her, imagining the echoes of the engines vibrating through the water, through time, through memory. He thought of his fellow pilots, lost to the ocean, lost to combat, lost to history. He thought of the countless missions, the endless horizon, the fragile line between life and death. And he understood finally that survival was only a fraction of the story. Memory, witness, and the stories that lived after the war were equally important. The next day, American forces arrived, taking control of the bay and the hangars. Bill was escorted away, free but forever marked by what he had seen, by what he had lost, and by what had been left behind. The P-38 remained. Her fate uncertain, her story preserved only in fragments, in photographs, in reports, and in the memory of a pilot who had once flown her to Tokyo Bay and survived. Long after the war, people would speak of aircraft lost in combat, of pilots missing in action, of missions that defied explanation. Some would whisper of a single P-38 that had landed miraculously in enemy territory, captured but not destroyed, dissected but never fully understood. They would call it a ghost, a legend, a testament to human ingenuity and courage. Bill remembered the moment he had skimmed the waves, the engines roaring once, twice, before silence claimed them. He remembered the water breaking around the fuselage, the tilt of the wings, the cold bite of salt water on his skin. He remembered the first sight of the Japanese soldiers hauling the plane from the bay, their hands studying her, cataloguing her, probing her as though she were a puzzle. And he remembered the quiet that followed, the quiet of the bay, the quiet of dawn, the quiet of a machine waiting for memory to carry it back to the sky. He turned from the water, shoulders heavy but spirit unbroken. The echoes of the P-38 would remain with him forever, in dreams, in stories, in the invisible trail she'd carved across the Pacific sky. She would always be alive somewhere, even if no longer in the world he could touch. And as the sun set over Tokyo Bay, Bill Harlow walked away from the pier, leaving behind a plane, a war, and a fragment of history, but carrying with him the memory of flight, untouchable, indomitable, and eternal.